Hello. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our competency-based education after COVID-19 discussion. The theme of our conversation will be how can new models empower learners and drive economic recovery? A couple of quick just housekeeping items. Please do introduce yourself in the chat. We want to make sure that we have a sense of who everyone is and where they're coming from and joining us from. If you could go ahead and do that while we're talking, that would be great. We'd like to level set on a few things in terms of today's recording. We want to make sure that you know that it is being recorded, and we will send out slides and an FAQ afterwards, of course, for your reference. We will be muting folks. If there's background noise, obviously want everyone to hear very clearly. Please take yourself off mute if you do want to chime in, but we'll also be monitoring the chat. So if there's questions that you have during the conversation, please pop it in there. We do have colleagues that are monitoring that chat and will let me know if we need to move some of those questions to the panelists. Also, during the presentation with the slides, you're going to see the speaker talking on the top of the screen. But when we get to the discussion portion, we will remove the slides and you can change your video layout to actually see most of the participants' faces. That way you have a clearer sense of who they are and what they're saying. Also, I wanted to share quickly the vision and mission that JFF has. We have a very strong point of view in terms of building a future and one that works for all. So our vision is a society in which economic advancement is attainable for all. That's what we envision for the world. And our mission is twofold. The first piece is building a society which everyone has the skills, resources, and credentials they need to achieve economic advancement. The second piece of that is to reach this goal, we drive transformation in the American workforce and education systems. We have a very strong point of view on that. What I'd like to do now is turn this over to my colleague and fellow moderator, Ana Gutierrez, to talk a little bit more about our Future Ready California Network and how that can potentially be impactful for the folks on the call today. Ana?
My name is Ana Berta Gutierrez. As my colleague just introduced me, I have the great pleasure of leading the Inclusive Regional Economic Development Unit at JFF and our state office here in California. A lot of our work in California, starting in 2015 when we opened up our office, was really centered around cross-sector partnerships and what it takes to make them work. At that time, there was a significant investment from the state in California College and Career Pathways Trust. And a lot of what we were doing was working with folks like all of you across educational segments, systems, across industry, and increasingly across other governmental partners that had a stake. And I think what ended up being really the North Star and driving vision of a lot of our partners who were doing education work. And that was really about leveraging their education work in order to create regional prosperity. So as a result of that work, what happened was that, we ended up trying to organize that cadre of leaders like yourselves here in California, to look at what will it take for our systems to be able to meet the need and the challenge of the future of learning, the future of work, and then increasingly the future of community growth and how we want to grow our economy and our communities to be able to create the education systems, pipelines, training, everything under the sun that are needed to help people ultimately move up the ladder. And that's what we're trying to do, is really focus our efforts on how do we create economic advancement for all. And so what you see there is, icons that represent kind of whether it's health, whether it's government, whether it's transportation, but all the different things that are really a part of what it takes to move the needle on equity gaps in education. And as you all know, those of you guys who touch education or are leaders in education, there is that dynamic between the educational strategies and reforms that we're pushing out within the context that our students and individuals have to face, right? And I will just share it, and as we go to the next slide, that for me personally, I was in the classroom as a teacher for 14 years, and I was right in that like middle swath right there that you see for human capital, really working with people. And one thing that kept recurring, whether I was doing work in the K-12 system or whether I was doing work in the community college system, is that I could be doing backflips and bringing the best of the educational strategies that I could possibly find and unearth. But if my students were hungry, if my students had to make false choices between childcare, work, or education, I would be on the losing end of that as a teacher. And so a lot of our work in the Inclusive Regional Economic Development Unit and at JFF is connecting the dots. And so what we're hopeful for you today is going into a deep dive around competency-based education, hearing from the experts that are on the panels around what we're learning, what we're seeing. But I think what I will leave you with is that a lot of our work is understanding where are we in the best position to lead, and where are the partners that are needed in order to make sure that we are providing comprehensive support to our students, that we are addressing the real place-based conditions that sometimes are impacting individuals, learners, and workers. So with that, I will go ahead and transfer it back to Raphael to lead us into the next section.
All right, great. Thank you, Anna. And just quickly to introduce myself so we can get right into the panelists. My name is Rafael Castañeda. I am a Director of Post-Secondary Strategy and Innovation here at JFF, and I'll be moderating the conversations with the panelists. So what are we trying to accomplish today? Obviously, we want to explore competency-based education. We want to focus in on how this can really be a driver for economic equitable recovery. It's a great opportunity to be able to move into that space and think, very thoughtfully about how we can really take that mantle up and drive these things forward. We also want to look at the shifts, the continuously shifting landscape for educators, training providers, employers, everyone associated with getting the workforce, skilled workers, and how we can do that the most efficient way with an equity lens. So those would be the objectives that we're looking for today. Can we move to the next slide, please? All right, so we feel that there are a few characteristics that are necessary for competency-based models to realize their full potential. These are not intended to be all the characteristics, but we feel that these are some pretty important ones. So if we think about CBE as a strategy for inclusive economic recovery, we want to look at how are they aligned to degrees. We want to make sure that they are able to build on one another, degrees and certifications in high value regional labor markets. We really want them to be work-centered. We want to make sure that workers are provided with uniformity in the way that colleges and employers look at and communicate about skills, because as students move to workers, obviously those two connection points are key. We also want to make sure that they're responsive to career advancement, meaning that it's not just when a student arrives, but once they get there, they also thrive on a continuous basis. So work-based learning and learning over the lifelong experiences, I think, is really important as well. So at the end of the day, this is not just a job, but it's a career and something that can be built upon. And then obviously the foundation of a lot of our focus is the equity-based focus. All aspects of design, implementation, continuous improvement of the program should be focused on how we can really utilize this to drive equity and meet the needs of all students, but specifically the needs of underrepresented students in higher education on a traditional basis. So let's get into some really great conversations with some experts who work in this every day. If we could please go to the first panel, I'd like to do some real quick introductions as they come on. We're going to be looking at topically, in what ways can competency-based education programs and training support inclusive economic recovery efforts? That's our theme. And I'd like to first introduce Dr. Charla Long. She's the Executive Director of the Competency-Based Education Network, known as CBEN, which is an international consortium of higher education institutions and statewide systems seeking to design, develop, and scale new models of student learning. So welcome, Dr. Long. I'd also like to introduce Nori Barajas, who is a principal on the academic partnerships team at InStride, which is a public benefit company whose mission is to develop the workforce of the future through career boosting, life-changing education opportunities provided by their employer. And also, I would like to introduce Corinne Bondal, who's the manager of global product support for ACAMS, where she supports B2B C-level executives worldwide by sharing best practices for global anti-money laundering risk and governance. And she completed an undergraduate and a graduate degree through a competency-based education program while working full-time. So really brings that lens to the conversation. So what I'd like to do is move to Dr. Long and ask her to talk to us about her experiences and how she feels that competency-based education design can drive economic recovery as she looks at that comparative piece of her work.
Yeah. Well, hello, everybody. It's great to be with you today. And just scrolling down the list of participants, it's good to see 2 Kates and 2 Jeffs that are on the line today that are have interesting contributions they've made to this field as well. So please know I stand here on the backs of so many who have done great work out in the field. Before I guess I answer, I think it might be helpful to just say the way we view competency-based education is really CBE is about what a person knows and can do, right? And that ability to master those competencies in order to earn a given credential really does take that asset-based approach. Everybody has competencies, not everybody has credit hours and courses that they've taken. And so when we start to think about what somebody knows and can do, it's a pretty liberating approach for education for folks that often haven't been well served. So when we look at what's happening in the field, I think one of the things you asked me to talk about is, what's going on? Is there increased interest as a result of the pandemic? And I would say absolutely. From a community college standpoint at four-year institutions, we see people making some really strategic investments with their COVID money. We see institutions really working on how can we build short-term credentials that can quickly respond to folks that find themselves in positions that have been eliminated or reduced or put on hold during a pandemic. So our colleagues in the hospitality and the culinary field, in areas in which their whole job has changed, how do we quickly reskill them for jobs in other areas? I think what's important to think about is how do we do that in an intentional way that helps those learners long-term economically, get them that social and economic mobility that they might want. So we're seeing a lot of institutions that are saying, how do we build a program that's good for a learner right now, but can be embedded into something bigger long term? How do we make sure that we can leverage this learning into an intentionally designed pathway to additional credentials or additional opportunities? To do that, you got to really understand who it is you're wanting to serve. Who are those learners? We believe that CBE, we share with JFF a belief that CBE can really help lead to more equitable outcomes, but only if it's intentionally designed. Only if you really think about your program in the lens of what do I need to do in order to meet this particular learner's needs. So those are some of the trends that we've been seeing just since COVID, this really increased focus on equity, the increased focus on short-term credentials that build into long-term careers, making sure that we're helping with that economic and social mobility for institutions.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Moving to Corinne now, how has graduating from a competency-based education program really shaped your thinking about the characteristics of education and training, and how are those best able to support workers in a rapid upskilling or reskilling environment?
Sure. Well, first of all, hi, everybody. It's really my pleasure to be here today and share my student experience with CBE, which for me was an extremely valuable and viable solution to effectively, and I think for me efficiently, upskill. So just a little bit of background for me. The summer after high school, I actually was accepted and attended a traditional four-year university program. And unfortunately, unforeseen circumstances resulted in me having to quickly drop out, I think after my second quarter. And so, of course, soon thereafter, I found myself joining the workforce in order to support myself and then eventually just my young, growing family. But it was always very important for me to finish what I'd started. I was the first person in my family to attend college, and so for me, earning a college education was definitely high priority. And subsequently, what ended up happening is I ended up spending the next 10 years plus attending school part-time. I usually was attending in the evenings or occasionally online, sometimes at more than one institution at a time, just to find the classes that I need. And it did take me over those 10 years to accidentally earn 2 associate's degrees just while trying to meet the core requirements for my major so that I can transfer back into a 4-year program. And so needless to say, just as a working professional, as a mother, earning my bachelor's degree at that time felt utterly unattainable. And thanks to some work colleagues, I happened to stumble across Western Governors University, which is an accredited online, CBE-based institution. And as Rafael mentioned earlier, I was able to complete both my bachelor's in business management and my master's in management and leadership through those programs. For me, I would just say it was incredibly helpful, especially as a working adult, in order to have the flexibility to go at my own pace and time without having to sacrifice the quality of the education and, I think most importantly, my financial health. Additionally, just my prior knowledge and work experience really helped me master and move through the content more quickly. I think what I appreciated the most were there were several instances where I was able to immediately apply my new competencies directly into my role at work, making an impact, for myself, for my team, and then ultimately the organization.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Moving to Nori now. So we're hearing a lot about employers struggling to recruit, retain, and upskill their workers and employees. Since the pandemic started, how are employers thinking about competency or skills-based solutions from your perspective?
Yeah, employers are very focused right now on attracting new talent, as you said, or retraining the talent they have through upskilling or reskilling. What we're finding, though, is that varies by industry vertical. For example, attracting new talent with IT, say, or supply chain experience is top of mind for some industries, whereas other industries are focused on upskilling the talent they have through relevant courses, or reskilling employees by capitalizing on skill adjacencies that can, through a short course or some form of training, help them move into a new role with some existing skill. In terms of workforce trends, we hear from many employers, actually specifically those who are seeking to create a more diverse workforce from within their current employee base. We're hearing that they want education solutions for their frontline. And one of the biggest requests we're getting is a scaffolded leadership education solution, something that has soft skills training that can take a frontline employee from, say, learning to lead self into management opportunities to learn to lead others. Another trend that thrills me is a greater focus on how job skills are described in posted job descriptions. I'm sure people on this call are all well aware that there has long been a disconnect between the way employers describe necessary skills and then the way institutions of education describe learning outcomes. And it's been hard to find parity between the two. And that's why CBE is such a powerful approach to learning, because it is designed to measure mastery of skills and can help with a common language. And honestly, there's never been a need to connect job skills to learning outcomes because of this greater demand for short courses and this focus on reskilling. So while employers are working to revise job skill descriptions, I'm also seeing that job seekers who have like the classic resume credential combination, they really need a more portable and descriptive record of their skills and their competencies. Especially as this short skill movement is really taking off, it will be more relevant than ever that these learners in the workforce have a way of providing evidence of the skills they've learned, mastery of those skills. Actually, I saw Jeff on the call, and I think the work of the Open Skills Network, US Chamber Foundation has the T3 network that's just starting up. And then Jeff and the seminal work of Credential Engine has been super important to the transparency and the effort to help translate these skills. Super relevant for competency-based learning, could be another whole webinar. But finally, one other point I want to make is, and maybe this is because my previous experience was in the painful process of creating transfer agreements between community colleges and a four-year institution. It is an arduous and one-on-one negotiation. And it is more important than ever that the skills the workforce are learning are transferred into eventually some degree bearing program, because we know this is where the life-changing education point happens. So while short courses are a rapid solution and they're important right now, I believe they have to have benefit to the employee in the future. They have to be stackable. So corporations, I'm loving this trend towards companies that are redescribing their skills. I like that higher ed and education skills providers are sitting up and paying more attention to how the learning outcomes can match up to these skills. And then main point is institutions of higher ed have to see these as legitimate learning, credit for prior learning assessments. In some way, they have to stack into those life-changing degree programs.
Excellent points. Thank you so much. So in one of those rare instances where we actually have a little bit more time than budgeted, I actually want to throw a question back to the panelists before we go and ask the audience a question. Just kind of going back to the economic recovery, the equitable components of that, like how are you taking that to the next level? Like I think that there's a very strong position in terms of stacking them, making sure that they're working for the student as they progress through the design of the courses. In the programs, obviously there's authorities on that and coming to more of an agreement across the board in terms of defining CBE. But how do you think about this from your professional perspective or from your personal perspective in terms of how can we really use these? What are some levers that can be pulled from your perspective on how this can be used to drive economic recovery in an equitable way? Would just love to hear some additional comments if you have any on that.
I'm happy to jump in. I don't know if others, I was waiting to see if somebody else wanted to go first here. Many of the many competencies that we have are transferable in settings, right? But they need some help being contextualized in a new setting. And so I think being able to help recognize those competencies that somebody brings that might not appear to be transferable, helping them think through how to contextualize that into a new setting and get folks back to work is really important. And I think that is a place that both sides of this equation have something to bring to bear, right? Employers can be very helpful in that, and so can higher ed institutions. And so I think that's an important place, is thinking about the transferability of competencies and how can I put that in a new contextual lens and bring that to life. I come from the hospitality industry. I'm a theme park lawyer. So a lot of folks, when you think about the hospitality field, it doesn't exist anymore, but they have a heart of service. They like caring for people. We need to take those kinds of characteristics and think about how do we turn those into early childhood educators? How do we turn that into healthcare professionals? We can take those skill sets that they have and help put them in a new context when we're really focusing on competencies and not what did you have this class or did you have that class? And I think that's really beneficial.
Yeah, Charla, I totally agree. And it makes me think of those adjacencies. Like you may be in a career right now that is kind of sunsetting in its necessity, but 75% of what you're competent at, what you've mastered, could put you in one of these newer jobs that are, we always talk about, what is it, 85% of the skills needed in the next couple of years are absent in the current workforce. So it's the adjacencies and finding how to plug in the other 25% of the skills that you get into that other area, and being able to break those down in small parts through competency-based education. It just helps that learner, that employee, get through the 75 they know, add the 25, and then be able to move into a new role.
Great, excellent. Corinne, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so from the other perspective, like from a learner perspective, I know for me, I was lucky enough just to hear about a CBE program through word of mouth. I'd never seen it that, this was, I don't know, 6-7 years ago. You weren't seeing commercials for Western Governors University online. Working for an ed tech continuing education supportive company for the last 10 years, you wouldn't open up their school catalog necessarily and see CBE programs. So I feel awareness to, employers and learners is very important, that there are alternatives, to the traditional education that, I know for my generation that we're just used to hearing and taking part in. And I feel another key component and something that was very helpful to me was just having the support of the employers, to whether that's the employers approaching their staff and employees, again, to preach awareness, or that they value competency-based learning. I know that, traditionally as a hiring manager and working with other hiring managers as well, we're looking for the elite Ivy League universities or those four-year universities. And even for myself, hesitate to say that I went the non-traditional route. So I feel what's very promising is that the mindset of CBE is starting to shift, which is, why I was so excited to participate in this conversation, because we wouldn't have had it, I think, pre-COVID as quickly. So that just the awareness is out there, the employer support, so employer support through tuition reimbursement to have those programs inclusive of CBE programs. I know is something hard, to provide those flexible working arrangements. And then also just to support their employees in any way that they can to continue their education journey, and then making sure that those employees are recognized for the additional contributions that they bring to their organization.
Excellent. Those are great points. I've been tracking along with the questions in the chat, and I since we have a little bit of time, I would like to go to one which I think is really important. And Kurt Madden got there first, so we're going to start with that one. If we can just quickly address, and I know there's been some commentary on this, but just want to throw that out there as well. It says, for the last several years, it seems like competency-based education is something that has tremendous support. I think you've all touched on that in some way. The potential outcomes are huge and well-defined, statement of fact, but adoption across K through 16 is tiny. How can we accelerate that adoption? If anybody on the panel would like to address that question, that'd be appreciated. Thank you.
It would be great if we put our money where our mouth is. I'd start there. I applaud the California Community College Chancellor's Office for putting money where their mouth is and helping to support schools that want to build direct assessment programs in this. I think it's also important that our government do the same thing. So if we're going to say we really like it, as we're giving out all this money right now, it would be wonderful if you made some of that money contingent upon the building of these kinds of programs. That's how we can transform a system. If not, we're going to have spent money and money and money without a lot of purpose and direction. So I really encourage all of us to think about how we're using this infusion of funds that could truly transform a higher ed system into a model that works on competencies. And appreciate Kelvin's comment. It's always great to push the demonstration project to prove that we could have a financial aid system not based on credit hours and course attainment, but instead on competencies. And so really hope that we're going to get there one of these days with the legislation.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So quickly, I would just like to thank you all for your participation. This has been exceptional, very robust, poignant points made. I'd like to go to the next slide and actually ask a question of the audience. You can go ahead and put your answer right into the chat. It's what groups of learners, workers, and industries can you see benefiting most from CBE in your region, and how can they best be served? And we'll continue on, but think about that question. It's something that we can pop into the chat as well. But we want to make sure that you're thinking about this in your own communities and in your own backyards as well. So let's go ahead and move on to panel 2. I would like to start our conversation off by topically thinking about how can a focus on skills and competencies support economic recovery and drive growth in a region. So I'd like to introduce our 3 panelists. Kelly Ryan Bailey is the Global Skills Evangelist at EMSI, where she focuses on facilitating the change to a skills-based hiring and learning economy through open skills data, standards, innovative products and services, and global initiatives and partnerships. I'd also like to welcome Charles Henkels, who is the Director of Regional Apprenticeship and Work-Based Learning at the Riverside Community College District. He leads the Inland Empire Desert Region College Consortium's Launch Apprenticeship Network. And I'd also like to welcome Fazilat Nasiri, who's the Director of Recruiting at Guild Education, where she specializes in the unique talent needs of startup organizations from seed stage through ongoing funding rounds. Welcome, panelists. Would love to jump right in here and start with you, Kelly. If you could tell us more about regional skill mapping and how this approach can support regional economic recovery.
I'd love to. It's such a pleasure to join you all today. I've been doing this work for, over 16 years now, and a lot of the names on the participant list are very familiar to me. So I appreciate, as Dr. Long mentioned earlier, that it's just a group of us collectively and not just us individually pushing towards this amazing work. My focus has always been on sort of using data and technology to create infrastructure, although I understand the importance, as we've talked about, employers really coming on board with, understanding, and also educators really making sure that they're fully communicating, not in the way we normally do in outcomes, but in maybe talking a little bit about the language of skills. We've gone through recessions before, of course, after the 2008 financial crisis. A lot of the challenges and discussions that were happening in regions that were trying to recover at the time it's sort of like Groundhog Day for me. I don't know about you guys, but they sound really familiar. And I had to sort of sit down because I've been doing this for so long, and that was really where a lot of the skills work had started. Why are we still today having some of these same challenges? We've had innovations, but I thought, with my work, I could easily come in here and talk a little bit about, what has really been the change from where we started so many years ago in using skills to make some of our decisions, and where that is now, because there has actually been quite a lot of innovation, But, we've all been busy trying to deal with what COVID has thrown our way. So, but, back at the time when this was happening, that was really, in 2008, I would say the few years after 2008, of course, as recessions work, after the moment of impact, we started using job posting data. And that was in the early days. There was no, job posting data, unlike government data, is extremely messy. And so there wasn't a lot of comfort level with the folks that were making these decisions and using this kind of data and really being able to rely on it and feel like it was pointing you in the right direction. Now we've come a long way from there. The initial skills taxonomies are long gone. We now talk about sort of these, ontological skill structures. And I think, the work, MZ is the third labor market analytics firm that I've worked with. I've been here for a 2-year period, and really they're at the forefront of the way this innovation is happening. And so it's just a pleasure to be able to work with an organization that sees and is embedded in so much of the work going on out there. And this really started with creating their own skills ontology. And this was the first time that an organization actually used not only demand data, job posting data, but also supply data to create an infrastructure around skills. And we open sourced this ontological library of skills. And surprisingly enough, someone mentioned, Nori, I know we've known each other too for a long time. Nori mentioned the work with Open Skills Network and Credential Engine. And a lot of this, this open skills library that MZ created is really the foundation for a lot of this work. So it's a really fantastic first step that has come so far from the way we're using skills as a translation layer. I know I've heard often over the last year people talking about skills being the translation, the common language. It's true, but unfortunately the infrastructure wasn't there. So now that infrastructure exists, so many more organizations are able to move towards the more equitable system. Now, skills on their own, it's helpful to a point. But one of the other areas that innovation is happening, and before I talk a little bit more about this regional work, because I think it's important to understand something that we are working on here at MZ and sort of refining that we call skill shapes, So skill shapes, if you think about this, every person has their own unique skill shape. I have different education history, different work history than everyone else here on this call, right? Every region has its own mix of specific employers with specific needs, with specific talent, and that creates its own unique skill shape. Every job, every piece of learning content, even down to the smallest, course, badge, what have you, micro-credential, whatever the smallest one is, right? They also have their own unique skill shape. It's just that, as we've described earlier, most of them weren't talking about their work in terms of skills. And so that's really the next step that has been taken in terms of innovation, is creating this concept of skill shapes and all of the tools that are allowing skill shapes to come to life. So now educators can do something a little bit more in terms of, before we could look at data and we could try to synthesize that data and determine, what are the types of skills that we want to train? How will we know when these are in demand? How can we change what we're offering in a particular region? That's sort of old-fashioned now. Now with the switch, with like the press of a button, essentially, they can load in their educational content and understand, translate it all into skills. And that not only gives the confidence to employers about what you're teaching, but it also allows students to better communicate what they're learning. Coming to, again, learning happens, right? Not only necessarily in higher education institutions, but there's so many various different learning providers. It's also really opened up the way that we can look at a region, because of course, now that we bring educators into the fold of talking about what skills they're able to train, we can start to look at regions a little bit differently. So opening up that concept of skill shapes, I'm going to give an example of some work that we did in collaboration with UNCF in the city of Atlanta. This is a really fascinating bit of work where we actually were collaborating to close some workforce opportunity gaps for students of color and young adults from disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, again, this is how far data goes, so I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but this is a really fun project because we were actually able to identify careers that were experiencing slow growth. They were offering low wages, and they just happened to have in this particular region an above average representation of Black workers. And so the skill data was leveraged to identify these career transitions and the reskilling needs in a region. One example where we were able to see how transferable skills could make a huge difference was in transitioning hospitality workers into sales roles. So of course, as you might imagine, they have two very different unique skill shapes if we're talking about skill shapes here, but there were some similarities. And that was really revolving around the customer. Of course, the hospitality roles also had business and management skills. You often see those in sales positions. So it was just a matter of understanding what the skill shapes of those potential roles looked like, and then also how to navigate those people in. And so you create these pathways. And this is done in amazing dashboards. I won't go all the way down into it, but hopefully I give you a breadth of that. And there's a lot more information that we can provide on how to make this actionable in any other region and help close these gaps.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. I think that the actionable science piece to the art and part science of this work is a really important piece. The lever pulling, if you will, I think is very, very helpful. So thank you so much for that. Shifting over to Faz, just wanted to start with, given your role in translating potential employees' skills to employers, what shifts do you see as necessary from education and training providers and employers to facilitate skills-based hiring and retention of those employees?
It's a great question. I think I'll start from the employer lens. And I think one of the first challenges that employers have is some of them are doubtful or not fully bought into skills-based hiring as a methodology for how they recruit. And they still kind of rely on outdated indicators like past experience, pedigree, GPA, and stuff like that to indicate success in a role. And I think this is a challenge that we can overcome with time and by having more thoughtful and well-informed conversations that help that kind of help us see, what the potential outcomes can be. And really, ultimately, I think having better data and being able to show those outcomes from using a skills-based approach can really help there. The second challenge is, a lot of employers are not really speaking the language of skills and don't know how to translate, as Nori mentioned, don't know how to translate a job description or what they think the job is into competencies and skills. And here, I think, it really requires intentionality and companies spending time and resources articulating those requirements of a role into competencies, and then really thinking deeply about what drives value for their teams and what does someone need to come in knowing how to do versus what can they train on the job. And as a recruiter, I see my role as, one, as a sounding board, and then two, as kind of like potentially challenging conventional thinking on who can be successful in a role here. And once we have a, short list of skills and competencies that really drive at the value we need in a role, thinking creatively about how can we assess those skills during an interview process. And I'll give you an example of this to kind of, drive the point home in kind of a more concrete way. A little while ago, I was working with a consulting team that was looking to hire for their team. And, they were deeply committed to hiring a diverse set of highly qualified individuals, but were really struggling. So the outcomes weren't there. And as we dug into their interview questions and their process, we came across this one question that they've been asking candidates, which was, tell me about a time when you've worked with a Fortune 500 company on a project, right? And this is a really great example of a question or an interview process that immediately shrinks the potential candidate pool and disqualifies any candidates who've not worked at a big consulting, at a big 5 consulting firm. Now, there's no way that as an employer you could reach, or as a team, you could reach your goal of hiring a diverse set of individuals while limiting yourself to only people who have experience working at a big 5 consulting firm. They're not necessarily known for their diversity. And so, with that team, I kind of challenged them to think a little bit more broadly and really think about, what are you looking for in that question? What is it that you're trying to get at with that question? And after digging a couple of layers, we came to the conclusion that they were really trying to assess for excellent written and verbal communication skills and polish. And those are, great skills and definitely required for in that job. And so the next thing we have to ask ourselves is there another way to test for that in an interview process that doesn't immediately disqualify those who haven't worked for Fortune 500 companies, but still have, excellent communication skills and polish? And with that, we kind of came up with, they were sending candidates home with a take-home project with a hypothetical scenario, and then asking them to present their ideas to a panel of their colleagues or their future colleagues as interviewers. And we felt that, like, one, getting them to create a slide deck or present their idea tested for written communication skills. And then in presenting in front of a group of individuals in a relatively high stakes situation like an interview was a pretty good approximation of presenting to high stakes clients at Fortune 500 companies, for example. And with that in place, the team felt really comfortable removing that question from their interviews for that role, and instead moving to a model where we assess for that skill instead. I think the thing I want to call out here is that process takes time. It takes intentionality, but the outcomes really speak for themselves. And those teams have come back, a couple of months later saying, we can't believe the quality of people we've hired who don't come from that traditional background that we had thought this is the only place that people can be successful in this role. Now, I think if we move to the institution lens, let's assume that employers are bought into skills-based hiring. As Nori mentioned, more often than not, the language that higher ed institutions speak, that candidates or learners are speaking, and what employers are speaking are not the same. And how they define a skill, how they measure or assess for those are not consistent. And really, I think that the people who suffer the most are the learners that are stuck in the middle, and they're unable to translate and articulate what they've learned and how what they've learned and how that's relevant to the jobs they're applying for. And I think we all know that mastering a skill is not necessarily the same thing as being able to speak to that skill. So it becomes especially challenging for first generation students or for those who lack social capital in the types of jobs they're applying for. So I think institutions that are, really invested in the outcomes for their learners can play a huge part here, either through career service offices or maybe even within the programs themselves, intentionally teasing out and helping learners articulate, what have you learned here? How have you learned it? And as Charla mentioned, how to contextualize that in an employer setting, or what does this mean in the work setting? And I think that will in itself just play a huge role in helping make sure that those candidates who have demonstrated mastery of a skill or a competency are not being left behind because they can't clearly speak to those with the language that employers understand and value.
Got it. That's fantastic. I definitely resonate with the challenge convention and then get everyone on the same sheet of music in terms of how to translate that. Excellent. Thank you so much. Charles, starting off with, why is it important for you to build competency-based apprenticeship and work-based learning opportunities in Riverside? And then continuing on with, how are you thinking about this model to support economic recovery?
Great, thanks. Well, I appreciate you having me here. I don't appreciate, being last because there's so many things that have been said over the past, 40 minutes that I'd love to dive in on. This has really been cool. But so quick introduction. Charles Henkels, and what I do with the Launch Apprenticeship Network is we're a consortium of community colleges that started working on creating new apprenticeship programs, partnering the regional businesses in our area with the community colleges. And when we started out, our intent, I think was, or our strategy was, we were going to leverage the infrastructure of the community colleges' existing CTE programs. And we would add to those work-based learning pathways for students, for, adults already in the workforce, but that's what we were putting together. And, what really, I think, has started to refine now our work around, this idea of competency-based education can kind of be summed up in a story. So we've been, working in this apprenticeship field for several years. We've had a lot of, in my opinion, a lot of success. Like it's been successful for the apprentices, for the businesses. Feedback has been positive. One of the stories though that we were told is we had an apprentice that went through, was working with a company, doing his apprenticeship, and he had shared this story. And the story was actually kind of told to me through the company. But basically, the apprentice had shared with his mentor. He said, you know, I've been an apprentice for 3 months. Before that, I was a college student for a year and a half, and I felt like I learned more in this 3-month period of apprenticeship than I learned in my year and a half in the college program, and which was kind of the same. It was the same content, and it was funny because when that mentor had told me that story, he very quickly made sure he wasn't actually telling me to offend what we were teaching at the college, but he jumped in. He said the reason he's able to do that is because he's contextualizing everything on the job as he's going. And so he said, you know what he learns, next day he's applying it, on the job. And I think for us, I think it brought up two really important elements from an education standpoint. One element was, we looked at this and we said, hey, there should be a way to evaluate if what that person is saying is true or not. So if someone really is learning more in 3 months than they are in a year and a half of kind of a conventional pathway, we should have a system in place that can evaluate that, because if it's true, it changes everything. Like it's one of those things where you go, if that's actually an accurate statement, then we need to really rethink how we're approaching education and providing learning experiences for residents in our community. I think that, so that was number one, was do we have a system in place where we could actually verify the accuracy of that statement? The second thing was that I think was, really kind of began to shape sort of our thoughts around this was, are we giving apprentices credit for being full-time learners? And where that, kind of comes from is most of the time when someone's going through an apprenticeship program, they're typically their class load is lighter than a full-time college student would be. So typically, an apprentice is going to take a class or two, in a semester. It doesn't look like a heavy load. And what happens is, if we only credited them for the learning that took place in that contact hour, and I think that was brought up a little bit earlier really well. But if we're only giving them credit for that, it's going to take them 8 years to get through an associate's degree. And so that was kind of the other big part of it, is we just went, look at this. One, there's a sense that people are learning more, and we're not set up in a way where we can assess that learning and make sure that it's meaningful. And then two, we're not set up in a way that we can also credit that learning. And so that's really what, I think brought us, to this table, so to speak, and why we're really engaged in it. I think for our businesses, our story with competency-based education is it's interesting. It's kind of the flip side. We had, I remember years ago, there was this is a little bit of a silly story, but I would walk in on a coworker who had quickly changed their computer screen. At which, obviously everyone's like, what in the world? But basically, one time I came in and what I noticed was my coworker was doing homework for a program. And I remember in my mind kind of having a moment where I said, this is crazy. Like, here's someone that wants to learn, wants to grow, and is using kind of, quote unquote company time to accomplish that. Imagine if you could link those things. Imagine if you could link that desire of somebody trying to grow, in their occupation, their profession, with a company's goals. Imagine if, company really saw their employees as assets, right, to be developed, how much that would change their view of how important it is to educate their people. And so I think, those are, like I said, kind of the collection of why we think this is important.
Yeah, no, it's great, and I appreciate the real world example there. I do want to spend just a quick minute on, I think, a really important question, and Faz, I'm gonna direct this back to you. There is a question about addressing the concern that skills-based hiring may not be enough to ensure equity, and there was a Forbes article that was referenced. So we'd just love to get a couple of minutes from your perspective on that question.
I think it's a great call out, and I totally agree. It is absolutely not enough to ensure equity. It's really just the first step into, into that process. And really, I think the point to drive home is if a team or a company is looking at skills-based hiring as the hot new trend of what everyone is talking about, then that is not necessarily a way for us to engage in actually, ensuring equitable outcomes. I think knowing that there is clear research and data on the impact of having diverse teams in solving complicated problems or bringing innovative solutions and what that means for a company's bottom line, them being bought into why this is important for our business I think is the key there. And then once you've kind of iterated that and the team understands why they are engaging in skills-based hiring versus any approach they've taken in the past, I think is the first key. Now, again, I totally agree that, like, let's say you bring in a diverse group of individuals, I think understanding and creating space where everyone understands why we have made this effort to bring this diverse set of individuals. Why not go to a big 5 consulting firm and just hire their top consultants all the time? Why do we choose to hire from a diverse set of backgrounds and experiences? And what that means for our business is really important to make sure that people don't feel tokenized, that don't feel like I'm the diversity hire on this team and this is why I've made it here. I think that is really important. And I would say, from my perspective as the recruiter, some of that does not fall on me. It kind of really just depends on, it doesn't just end with the recruiting. I think it depends on the culture of the company as a whole, the culture of those teams, and something that they absolutely need to be mindful of.
Love it and agree. Definitely have work to do in this area. But I think, in closing, there's certainly, I think, just a tremendous amount of relevance across this holistic spectrum. We've heard from all of our panelists who are experts in certain segments of this area, and there's just so much work to be done there. So if we can go to the last slide, please. We were going to make sure that everyone gets out of here on time. Thank you so much to the panelists for your insights, for your expertise, for your willingness to participate. We put some connections links in the chat. Please take a moment to reach out to these folks if you are a participant. Definitely a ton of knowledge there, great opportunities for collaboration. So here's just a few call outs that we would like to do. We'd actually like to hear from you. There's a survey link in the chat, and we'll send this out again. Of course, you're going to get surveyed, right? But we would also encourage you to engage, lean in if you aren't already, or if you are and you'd like to take it to that next level. So join our Future Ready California network if you're in California. Subscribe and pilot CBE programs. Design these areas in your work and invest in this for the future. And obviously JFF stands prepared as a strong partner and an owner of a very large and dynamic network who can help you solve these problems in your area. So once again, thank you so much to all of the panelists. Thank you to the participants. We hope that you've enjoyed this hour and we hope that it has in some way driven thoughtful consideration of competency-based education and how it can work potentially for you in terms of driving economic recovery after this pandemic. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and enjoy your afternoon. Thanks so much.